Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Zoom na Cartografia. Can you hear me well? Okay. Dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for us today to welcome Professor Adriana Leitão and her PhD student, Matheus Gomes Silva, who are our guests today. Adriana is an associate professor at the Linguistics and Philology Department at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She is the coordinator of the Biology of Language Research Group from the same university. She does research in syntax by focusing on the linguistic knowledge of health individuals, as well as of those with linguistic pathologies. Her research also focuses on first and second language acquisition. Professor Adriana's research topics are mainly concerned with the mental representation of the category of aspect. She currently has two main research projects. One focuses on the representation of and realization of tense and aspect in natural languages, and another focusing on language pathologies. She has also published a book on syntax and aphasia, issued by New Academic Edition, Saarbrücken. And Matheus is a linguistics PhD student at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. His research focuses on the syntax of the so-called 10 categories in English and in Brazilian Portuguese. Matheus is a member of the Biology of Language Research Group, and he is part of the research project, Filters of Tense and Aspect in the Language Faculty, and its linguistic achievements. Matheus is also interested in the mental representation of aspects in natural languages from a cartographic perspective and in the teaching of tense and aspect in English as a second language. Adriana and Matheus will have an hour to give your conference, which is entitled A Cartographic Approach to Imperfectivity. After that, we will have some time for discussion. So, please, if you have any questions, just send us in the YouTube chat with your name, country, and institution, or send us an email to tescari@unicamp.br. And now, Adriana and Matheus, welcome to Zoom na Cartografia. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Now, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Sandra.
Thank you. I would like to thank for this presentation, for Sandra's presentation, and also for Achilles and Sandra's invitation, for this prestigious invitation. It's an honor to be here. I would like to thank Biology of Language, my research group, for all the support. And I would like to thank in advance to all the audience for the contributions and criticisms. It will be a pleasure to hear you after the presentation. So let's start. As Sandra has already said, this presentation has as its title, A Cartographic Approach to Imperfectivity. I'm Adriana Leitão Martins, and my PhD student under my supervision is Matheus Gomes Alves. So we are from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I would like to start explaining the main goal and specific goals of this talk. So as our main goal, we have the objective of investigating the derivation of sentences with some aspectual phrases related to the imperfectivity. We are going to explain a little bit about imperfectivity and the aspectual phrases which are under scrutiny in this specific work. So our specific goals are: 1, analyzing the order of production of adverbs in English related to the habitual, continuative, durative, respective, and inceptive aspects associated with the present tense, and 2, analyzing the readings triggered by different orders of adverbs in English related to the habitual, continuative, durative, respective, and inceptive aspects associated with the present tense. So we want to investigate the orders of the adverbs related to each of these 5 aspectual phrases in sentences in English, and the readings triggered by each of these orders. In order to do so, the outline of this presentation is the following. We have an introduction where we're going to explain our main framework, the presentation of the hypothesis, and then methodology and results. We're going to show a step of our methodology. It's an experimental work, and the results related to this step. And then we follow to the next step. Then we're going to present our analysis, and finally, the final remarks. So, Matheus, please.
Thank you, Professor Adriana. So prior to stating the major tenets of synthetic cartography, it is of primordial importance to regard to what we conceive as imperfectivity. So when we talk about imperfectivity, we are in the repertoire of aspect. And according to Conrad's 1976 definition of aspect can be conceived as different ways of regarding or conceiving the internal temporal constituency of a situation. And Conrad also tackles one of the most prototypical divisions that tend to occur in the grammaticalization of natural languages, which are the difference between perfective aspect and imperfective aspect. According to Conrad's work, perfective aspect would regard to atomic eventualities. It means that when there is a sentence conveying perfective aspect, focus is not placed in the internal phases of the event, but rather what is being focused is the event as a whole. However, when we conceive the definition of imperfective aspect as proposed in Conrad, we could see that the perfective aspect regards to non-atomic eventualities. It means that focus is actually placed in the internal phases of an event. And Conrad also understands that the most prototypical way to occur imperfectivity in natural languages is the one that divides the imperfective aspect in habitual aspect and continuous aspect. According to Conrad, a sentence conveying habitual aspect, for instance, would describe an eventuality as ordinary to a certain moment of reference. So when we have a sentence in English, such as, Peter usually swims on Tuesdays, it is viable to assume that there is an event of swimming which occurs in an ordinary way every Tuesday. Therefore, we are dealing with a habitual eventuality. It's also important to clarify that the term eventuality is being used here as a protean term to events as a whole. So when we conceive the term eventuality, we're actually tackling one of the major aspects concerning Wendlerian tradition. So we are dealing with predicates of events, of actions, of states, of achievements and accomplishments as a whole. So that's why we are using this term. So just to sum it up, habitual aspect regards to an eventuality being described as ordinary to a certain moment of reference. However, Corey understands the continuous aspect as being an instance of an eventuality being described as ongoing or simultaneous to a certain moment of reference. For instance, when we analyze a sentence such as Peter is swimming, there is an event of swimming of which Peter is the agent, and the event of swimming occurs simultaneously to a certain interval of time I. Therefore, we are dealing with the continuous aspect conveying in English, in natural languages as well. If we understand that imperfectivity is appertained to the focus that is being placed in the internal phases of a certain eventuality, we could understand also that some of Cinque's 1999 functional projections, specifically the ones concerned with the spectral features as well, are in fact concerned with imperfectivity in Corey's terms. So, of course, there is a sheer number of projections in the approach of Cinque in the middle field analysis, but we would like to pinpoint some of the projections that are to be under scrutiny on our work. So we're going to focus on the projections of HASP, habitual P, ASP continuative P, ASP durative P, ASP prospective P, and ASP inceptive P. This does not mean, though, that the other projections are not entirely directly or indirectly related to imperfectivity. It just means that by the imperative of experimental design, we had analyzed as explicitly possible to design experiments with these aspectual heads. So when we analyze the higher aspectual projection in Cinque's middle field, which is the ASP habitual P, we of course can see that the unmarked feature to be checked by means of verbal movement or phrasal movement is the habitual feature. And Cinque's also acknowledge that adverbs such as usually would be placed in the specifier position of this projection. When we understand that there is also a projection which is slightly lower called ASP continuative P, we are dealing with a projection in which there is a feature of continuative or minus continuative event to be checked by means of verbal movement or any sort of movement. And Cinque also understands that the adverb still would be placed in its specifier position. When we are talking about the continuative aspect, we understand that the continuative aspect regards to a situation which has a continuity meaning. Therefore, there is the checking of this feature by means of verbal movement or phrasal movement to check the semantic feature as well. When we are dealing with ASP durative P, there is also the idea that the marked feature would be the progressive, the durative, and the unmarked feature would be the minus durative. And the adverbs that would be placed in the specifier position of ASP durative P would be adverbs such as briefly and others. Concerning the projection as prospective P, which has in its head the feature plus perspective or minus perspective, Cinque's acknowledged that the adverb almost would be placed in the specifier position of also this projection. And the idea of as perspective, the feature of perspectiveness, is that we are actually analyzing the point that immediately precedes the start of a certain event, of a certain situation. When we are concerning the meaning and the representation of a projection such as asp inceptive B, we are actually tackling the idea that upon this projection, there would be in its head the feature plus inceptive as a marked value or minus plus inceptive as a marked value to be checked. And adverbs such as subtly would also be placed in the specifier position of this projection. So I guess it's clear now that although many other projections are in fact related to imperfectivity, if you understand imperfectivity as placing focus to internal phases of event, we're just going to focus upon these 5. And we have to justify that the focus upon these 5 projections are merely related, are merely appertained to experimental design. Okay, so according to Cinque's universal hierarchy, these projections would be placed in the middle field as follows. So we have asp habitual, which dominates asp continuative, which dominates asp durative, which dominates as prospective, and finally, which dominates as inceptive. And it's also important to remind you all that the process of making these universal order of merge of functional projections is really appertained to Jack Indoff's criterion, which is placed in 1972 work. So by means of precedence and transitivity tests, Cinque acknowledges that when we compare the order of certain adverbs in a sentence and its direct opposite in another sentence, and we have a difference in terms of judgments of grammaticality, it might relate to also the order of merge. So the idea of the tests that are employed in Cinque's methodology is also directly related to the Jack Indoff's criterion as stating that the sentence adverbs of the same semantic kind cannot co-occur. So if we have a sentence such as, Peter usually still plays soccer, the co-occurrence of the adverbs usually with the adverb still is a sign that we are dealing with adverbs of different semantic kinds, since they are co-occurring in a sentence. That's the major tenet of Jack Indoff's criterion. Also, the process of making and analyzing Cinque's hierarchy is incredibly appertained to Keynes' principle as stated in the work of 2005A, which highlights the fact that for each projection, there is one feature, one head. And this principle is the core principle, I would say, to every cartographic analysis that is aimed at adopting a Cinque analysis of the middle field. And of course, if you are talking about the underlying structure and the relation between linear order and order of merge, we are also tackling Keynes' unsymmetric theory. So when we are dealing with Keynes' unsymmetric theory, we are assuming that, for instance, there is an underlying order and all the differences in terms of linear order would be a byproduct of movements. Cinque, of course, when proposing the universal hierarchy approach, places some regards about the variation of these projections in natural languages. So according to Cinque's cartography, there will be no variation in terms of the type and order of functional projections, but rather there will be some context of alleged variation of these universal order. So if we have, for instance, a sentence which in a naive analysis would be would imply a different order of merge in terms of Cinque's analysis, actually, what we are dealing with is the fact that might have happened a modification structure, or even the checking of features in the left periphery by means of the checking of information structure features of top, POC, or any sort, be it of any sort. When we have W8 movement, deceptive co-occurrence, non-inherent focus, or even perithetic intonation. So it's widely spread the assumption that when we are dealing with a sentence and we place our internal prosody, or even when we place our external prosody by just reading the sentence, it's also possible to move certain constituents to the left periphery, and therefore the movement of constituents to left periphery and all over these contexts of alleged violation would blur the order of merge, but we actually are not placing distinct orders of merge. The order of merge would be unified. And also, as Kane proposes in 1998, we understand that scope might be related to this phenomenon as well. So we assume the definition of scope and the understanding of scope as assumed in Kane. So according to Kane, UG leaves no choice. Scope must be expressed hierarchically. There are no covert LF phrasal movements permitted by UG, and neither can the effect of covert phrasal movement be achieved by feature raising. Scope reflects the interaction of merge and overt movement. It means that when we are analyzing scope, we have to understand that the scope is not a primordial or even a unique characteristic of the interface levels, but actually a characteristic that occurs in error syntax in the process of merge and movement. We have come up with some terminology that we understand as being relevant to this work. And this terminology is by no means political. It does not mean a criticism to any sort of theory. It's just a way to clarify what we are going to do in this research. So when we are dealing with cinquean linear order, in our terms, we have a sentence that apparently has the same order as the universal hierarchy would imply. So when we have a sentence like Peter usually still swims, we had the linear order as being correspondent to the order of merge, according to Cinque's approach. When we have non-cinquean linear order, we just have a different order. It does not mean that Cinque did not propose any sort of analysis. As we were just saying in the preceding slide, there are a plethora of aspects and variation contexts that are to be explained in terms of the cartography project. We are just saying that when we have a different linear order, this different linear order is not directly predicted by the universal hierarchy, but just indirectly by means of phrasal movement. Of course, we had come up with the idea of tackling the progressive scope as this when the C commanding adverb allegedly attributes scope over a C commanded adverb, and the regressive scope as regarded to the process of the C commanded adverb allegedly attributing scope over a C commanding adverb. So, for instance, when we have a sentence such as John usually steals its cake, we're dealing with cinquean linear order, and we are applying a progressive scope reading, of which we can state that there is a continuous event of eating cake, of which John is the agent, and this continuous event of eating cake happens on an ordinary basis. So it's a habitual event. So we can understand that usually, or the habitual aspect is applying scope over still. When we have John still usually eats cake, we would have non-cinquean linear order, and we could say that there is a possible reading of there is a habitual event of eating cake, of which John is the agent, and this habitual event occurs in a continuative way. Of course, we acknowledge the existence of the scope principle as proposed in Ernest 1991. So Ernest understands that a merged item would still have scope over a C-commanded item, even though the former is linearized at its right. However, interesting as this principle seems, we have to question how hard this principle really is, if we in fact are to have the same kind of interpretation, even if we change the order. So our work and our experiments are intended actually to check how hard this principle really is as well. We constitute as hypothesis of our work the following. So According to our hypothesis, both cinquent orders and non-cinquent orders of the adverbs under scrutiny, namely the ones usually, still, usually, still, almost, still, briefly, almost, briefly, and briefly, suddenly, briefly, would be identified in sentences in English associated with the present tense. So prior to understanding what kind of reading these orders would trigger, we are actually trying to identify if they're in fact possible in English. That's why we propose the first hypothesis. The second and third hypothesis concern to our second specific goal. And by this, we say that cinquent linear orders of the adverbs under scrutiny, namely usually, still, almost, briefly, almost, and briefly, suddenly, would only trigger progressive scope reading, and non-cinquent linear orders would only trigger regressive scope reading. We are trying to see if there is a one-to-one correspondence between linear order and non-linear order and the reading of the scope that is being triggered. That's why these hypotheses were proposed. That's the rationale of proposing that.
So in order to test these hypotheses, we adopted the following methodology. First of all, we analyzed the web corp in order to achieve the first objective and to test the first hypothesis that Matheus showed the prior slide. In the prior slide. So we quantified the frequency of the orders under scrutiny, the orders of the adverbs, the 5 or 10 possible orders, yeah, because we are testing if both would appear. And we applied a logistic binomial regression task, taking the orders as definite variables. Our prediction was that both orders, usually still, usually, still, almost, still, briefly, almost briefly, and briefly, suddenly, briefly, are possible in English sentences. So we'd like to test that. And what we found? What did we find? So the table 2 show the 10 different orders or 5 possible combinations in the 2 ways, usually, still, usually, still, almost, and almost still, and all of them. And we have 2 columns, Bing and The Guardian, because these are the 2 websites where the Web Corp extracted the data. Yeah, so I'm going to read the total numbers. For example, usually, still, and still, usually were both found 81 times. We had 81 occurrences. Still, almost 75 occurrences, almost, still 61, almost, briefly 24, briefly, almost 38, briefly, suddenly 22, and suddenly, briefly 26. When we see table 3 on the right, we have the total occurrences of cinquent linear orders of the adverbs, and we had 216 occurrences, and the total of non-cinquent linear orders when we see, for instance, still, usually, almost, still, briefly, almost, and suddenly, briefly, and we had 192 occurrences, or 47%. When we saw with the binomial test in table 4, we checked that was not relevant. So the p-value 0.255 does not show any difference in between cinquent and non-cinquent linear orders. So here we have some examples of sentences found in Web Corp with these orders. Usually, still, you can usually still join their pension if you want to. Still, usually, an autism diagnosis for young children is still usually based on the triad of impairments. Still, almost, can industry business of sport shopper numbers are still almost 30% below pre-pandemic levels. Almost still, you can almost still hear children's laughter, almost briefly, but it almost briefly caused mutinity mutiny in the small colony, briefly almost, you're still briefly almost famous, briefly suddenly, anyone if I made friends with, even briefly suddenly unavailable, and suddenly briefly it appeared, suddenly briefly outshone. So we can see that both orders are possible, and we are going to investigate with another method if these two different orders trigger different readings. I would like to call attention for briefly almost, because this sentence that we pinned here, you're still briefly almost famous, we have three adverbs which are investigated in this research, although this was not our intention to study three adverbs together, just two. But it's interesting because in this sentence we have three adverbs and they are in the Chimpan linear order. So the second part of this methodology includes the development and of two behavioral tests which were remotely applied to 20 native speakers of English. The research was approved by the Health Ethics Commission, and both tests had the following structure. The first part was an informed consent forms where the participants could read about the test, what they should do. Then we had a questionnaire where the participants should inform their gender, their country of birth, their age. Then we had the trial section with one sentence, one stimulus, which was shown in order to present what the participant should do. And then we have a pseudo-randomized target and distractor sentences. We had target and distractor in the test. And then we had a final section with the comments, and the participant could leave his or her email and leave comments too. The two tests we developed were forced choice task and syntactic ordering task. I'm going to explain each of them separately. The first one, the forced choice task, had as its independent variable the linear order, which could be cinquent or non-cinquent, and as the dependent variable, the progressive scope reading and the regressive scope reading. So how was this task? For example, the participant saw a sentence like John still almost runs the marathon, and he should choose one of these two options. The information under in parentheses was not shown to the participant. So for instance, the first option, John runs the marathon every year. This year, John no longer runs the marathon. In this case, we have the scope of almost over still. And the second option was John prepares himself to run the marathon every year. Every time the marathon is about to start, he's always prevented from running. So in this case, we have the scope of still over almost. So see, in this option, we have, in the second option, we have the progressive scope reading, since still is the habitual phrase adverb, and almost is the perspective adverb, perspective phrase adverb. And in the first option, we have the regressive scope reading, since we have almost giving scope over still. So our predictions were that option B, which conveys progressive scope reading, would only be chosen to paraphrase the meaning of the sentences with cinquent linear order, and option A, which conveys regressive scope meaning reading, would only be chosen to paraphrase the meaning of the sentences with non-cinquent linear order. So what we found with this test. The results show that we had both readings with both orders. In figure 1 on the left, we have in the lines first the cinquant linear order and then the non-cinquant linear order for each of the combinations. Usually, still, usually, still, almost, still. So for instance, with the usually, still, the first line, we had both answers, 10 readings of progressive scope and 10 with regressive scope. Usually, still, usually, we had 12 regressive scope readings. Still, almost, we had 19 progressive scope readings, and almost still, we had 11 progressive scope readings. With briefly, almost, we had 17 regressive scope readings, and almost briefly, 14 regressive scope readings. With briefly, suddenly, 14 regressive scope readings, and suddenly, briefly, 18 regressive scope readings. So on the right, we have the logistic regression test. With the progressive scope, we found the following. First, order still almost as a factor of progressive scope reading. So this p-value shows that it's relevant. We are only showing what was significant in our logistic regression test. So orders still almost and almost still as factors of the progressive scope reading, order briefly almost as a negative factor of progressive scope. So I would like to call your attention to order still almost, which is the third line in figure 1. You see that we had 9, 10 answers for progressive reading. And when we are talking about briefly almost, which is the 5th line in our figure, we had mostly regressive scope readings, although this is the cinquant linear order. And with the regressive scope, we had one relevant difference between the regressive scope readings in the orders of still almost and almost still, as we saw above, and orders suddenly briefly as a factor of regressive scope reading. So suddenly briefly is the final line in the figure on the left, and we had 18 regressive scope readings, and that was a non-cinquant linear order. Finally, the third step in our methodology was the syntactic ordering task. We had as the independent variable the scope, which could be progressive or regressive, and as the dependent variable the cinquant linear order and the non-cinquant linear order. So how was this task? In this case, we presented in the sentence above what I want to say, the scope we intended to call attention, the reading we intended to promote. For instance, regularly Peter keeps astonishing her, and the informant should put these words in order. We asked them to always start the sentence with the proper name, like Peter in this case. So in this, with this indication, we would like to avoid the movement of one of the adverbs to the front, to the left periphery, in order to avoid the scope which was not the one intended here. So here with this scope, Peter regular keeps astonishing her, we expected the informant to say Peter usually still astonishes her. This in this order. Our predictions were that one, sentences with cinquant linear order would only be chosen to convey progressive scope meaning, progressive scope reading, like the one just shown. And number 2, sentences with non-sequential linear order would be chosen to convey regressive scope reading. So what did we find here? In this test, we could see that the orders chosen were a little bit similar to both contexts briefly presented. So, for instance, here in figure 2 on the left, we have progressive and regressive contexts and the possible orders of adverbs. For instance, usually, still, or still, usually. When we had the progressive context, the context presented, we had 14 non-sequential linear order, still, usually. And when we have regressive scope presented, we had 16 non-sequential order, with still, almost, and almost still in the progressive context, 15 sequential order, with the regressive context, 14 linear order. With briefly, almost briefly, we had 10 progressive and sequential and non-sequential linear order. And in the regressive context, we had 13 non-sequential linear order. With briefly, suddenly, briefly, in the progressive context, we had 17 non-sequential linear order, and finally, in the regressive context, 19 non-sequential linear order. So I would like to call your attention to the fact that although not all of them are significant, we had a little bit more choices for the sequential orders in progressive context. When we compare line 1 with 2, line 3 with 4, 5 with 6, and here in table 6 we had the multinomial logistic regression test, which showed that usually, still, usually in the regressive context is significant. The p-value 0.013 shows that. So usually, still, usually in the regressive context is the second line in the figure. And then still, almost still, we had, which refers to the third line in the figure, we had a p-value which shows significance for the chosen of sequential orders in progressive context. Finally, the last line of the table 6, briefly, suddenly, briefly. When we had these adverbs combined in progressive and regressive context, we had mostly non-sequential linear order, which refers to the 7th and 8th line of the figure, which shows that the non-sequential linear order were mostly chosen in these both contexts. Matheus?
I'm sorry, I was just trying to get on the mic. Okay, so concerning the results of the web corp analysis, it's possible to state that sequential and non-sequential linear orders of the adverbs under scrutiny are in fact possible in English. So both of them are possible in English. I would like to highlight also that when we were scrutinizing the web corp corpus, we were really careful about choosing occurrences that did not have comma. So we avoid the interpretation that by means of a different punctuation or even a different usage, the adverb would have a prosody pause and therefore would go to a different periphery, to the left periphery. And there seems to be no difference in terms of how frequent these orderings are. And some of the results that we have found in the web corp analysis are to be checked out as well by the same idea that Cinque provides in 1999. So it's plausible to state that the checking of information structure, though careful we were, might have happened, since we are dealing with subjects, with informants that apply internal prosody. So even if we are careful about choosing the occurrences that did not have comma, it's possible that when writing the subject, the person that had produced it, had an intentional meaning of placing focus to a certain adverb. So it's also possible. We can also rely on the remnant movement approach to justify and to explain some of these results. So we could say that by means of subtraction of certain part of a constituent, and then the remnant approach and the remnant movement and extraction of subject, it's possible to explain the non-cinquent linear orders. Also, we can rely on the direct modification structure approach, by which we intend to say that it is possible that a certain adverb had moved or is placed in the specifier position of a head that is associated to another adverb. So we have, for instance, an example such as an autism diagnosis for young children is still usually based on the triad of impairments. So it's possible to explain disordering by saying that still may be directly modifying usually, and therefore we would have this blurring order of linearization, but we are not really implying that we have a different order of merge. When we have, you can almost still hear children's laughter, it's possible to explain disordering if we understand that almost is a scalar adverb, and therefore it can check features in the left periphery, even though careful we were to collect this stimulus, it might have happened when the person had produced it. So all of these occurrences can be explained in Cinque's terms, in the parameters that Cinque had developed in its first publication in 1999. Also, concerning the behavioral tests results, some hypotheses are proposed. The first one is kind of obvious, but we have to say, some scope readings may be more commonly triggered than other scope readings, not because we are dealing with different orders, but in fact that because there is the applying of some semantic principles, or even third factor principles in Chomskyan term. So if we are dealing with a sentence such as, Anne briefly suddenly talks to John, perhaps it's easier to interpret this sentence as, there is a sudden event of talking to John that happened briefly, then there is a brief event that happened suddenly, or the other way around. So perhaps there is difference in terms of how hard a certain reading would go to our interface levels. So we may have to explain this by saying that by means of applying of some semantic principles, perhaps in the lines of earnest work, we could explain some of the readings found. Also, it's possible to state and to rely in a duplication approach. So perhaps we have to, of course, analyze it, go over a bit in depth to argue this way, but there will be two different positions of adverbs, such as still and almost, and the middle field. And perhaps when we have progressive scope reading, we are either taking a projection which applies scope over the event, and another projection would apply scopes over the process, or the other way around when we have a different linear order. So when we have an order such as Mark almost still passes the exam, perhaps this apparent deviation of the universal hierarchy, this alleged deviation of the universal hierarchy, could be explained by the fact that we are in fact accessing different positions of almost and different positions of still. And therefore, when we are access these different positions, the order would be blurred, but it would not imply, as we are trying to say, that we have different orders of merge. Also, we have to do some mea culpa here. So the results found might have been biased by the type of tests we proposed. So since we are dealing with offline processing and not online processing, and since we are not controlling time of reaction to certain stimuli, perhaps this may have had influenced some of our results. Of course, I intend in my PhD dissertation go a little bit in depth about these hypotheses and trying to use different methodological procedures controlling offline variables and online variables. And also, concerning this third hypothesis, it's also possible to state that the choice of certain stimuli or even the paraphrases of these stimuli may have had some influence in terms of how difficult or easy is a certain paraphrase to apply to a certain stimulus. So it's possible, though. I would like to pose a comment about the third hypothesis. We are also acknowledging the fact that it's possible that some of our procedures may have influenced our results. But a recent analysis conducted by me, Professor Adriana, and Professor Juliana Nespoli had found that when we have judgment tests, a judgment test with cinquant and non-cinquant linear orders, the only context of these adverbs in which the informants did not like that much the linear order without context, without a context of scope reading, is the one concerned with the difference between still almost and almost still. And what is funny is that the only context in this work that is relevant in terms of scope, in this work that we are showing right now, is the one is still almost still. So some of our investigations are really fine-tuned in terms of how a certain informant would react to a non-cinquant linear order when we do not apply, for instance, a forced scope reading as we are doing here. So of course we do the mea culpa, but it's important to stay so. So the adverb may also check some features in the left periphery. So almost may go to the left periphery. It's inevitable sometimes to control it. We should have perhaps worked with a oral input to try to control it. But when we have a sentence like Andrew almost briefly feels lonely, it's possible that the adverb may have gone to the left periphery and we have a blurred linearization. And of course, we understand that some of the non-cinquant linear orders may be a byproduct of direct modification structures, as we were just saying in the web corp analysis. So in Mark almost still passes the exam, perhaps almost is directly modifying still, and therefore we would have this different linear order, this odd linear order. And we can also explain that some of the orders that we found and some of the results proposed may be a byproduct of the remnant movement approach, by which we say that when we have sentences like Mark still almost passes the exam with cinquant linear order, we do not have some difficulties because we just move and merge, we just move and merge, which is easier if we follow the map of the order of merge of cinquents. But when we have Mark almost still passes the exam, we perhaps had different movement operations, be it of any sort, piping, whose pictures or pictures of whom. So let's go over proposal of derivation of a sentence such as Mark almost still passes the exam. So in a sentence like Mark almost still passes the exam, we are going to propose a derivation in the Larsonian way, even though we assume that left-right symmetry is what we are really trying to do. So when we have a VP or little VP such as Mark passes the exam, we would have the movement of the VP to the medial position of S perspective P, carrying the object as well. So the feature of perspectiveness is checked in the specifier position of S perspective, and then the merge of almost in the head that directly C commands as perspective P as adverb perspective P. Then we would have movement in a pictures of one way to the specifier position of S continuative P to check the feature of continuative event, and then the merge of still. It's also possible to see that after the merge of still in the projection, the directly C commands as continuative P, We might have had movement to a different projection, such as KP of the adverb continuative P, and then subtraction of part of the constituent. And by subtraction, we understand that subtraction is possible since it still passes the exam, had not checked any sort of criterial feature. Therefore, it can be subtracted according to the criteria freezing. And then we'll have remnant movement, and finally, the extraction of mark in subject P. It's also important that to highlight that the extraction of mark in subject P is in the lines of Cinque's analysis about the extraction of the subject in English. So Cinque acknowledges that extraction of subject P in English sentences would occur in a position, in a place which is higher than T anterior. Therefore, when we subtract the subject here, we are saying we're also buying the same idea, okay? And the extraction is caused by the imperative of mark to check the feature of subject of predication. And these are the steps that we had proposed here. Of course, that's a major proposal. We can also discuss this derivation later. So concerning our hypothesis, we had seen that indeed, all the cinque orders and non-cinque orders are possible in English. They're all possible in English. And they seem to be quite present in the corpus we had gone over. However, there is no one-to-one relation between cinque linear order and the scope reading. The only context in both tests that we had presented here, in which scope may be regarded as a factor to foresee the kind of reading, the kind of order at hand, is the context that differentiates still almost and almost still. So there is no one-to-one relation. Scope and cinque and non-cinque orders might not be that intertwined, but when we are talking about cinque order still almost, and the non-cinque order almost still, and the progressive and regressive scope reading, it seems to be something somehow related to the fact that when we have progressive scope, most subjects understand that the still almost order would be preferable. When we have non-regressive scope, in both tests, the subjects, the participants, understood that the non-cinque linear order almost still would be preferable. So these are our major findings. These are our references as well. And thank you for your attention and for the kind invitation. And it's an honor to be here with some of the most admirable cartographers that I know in Brazil. So I feel honored and I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Adriana and Matheus, for such an enlightening talk. I like so much. So now I'm going to address some of the questions that we have received from our audience. And if you have questions, please, you can still send us through the chat or email pescari@unicamp.br. Now, a student from the La Casa Lab emailed us the following question. How could one distinguish between the so-called habitual aspect and the iterative or frequentative aspect? It looks as though they refer to the same aspect category from a semantic perspective.
I would like to thank you again for the invitation, for the possibility of hear these questions, and the first question is a very interesting one. It's something that we always discuss in our research group. We are dealing with the spectral meanings for a long time. And one point that I would like to call attention is about Conrad's definition about habituality. According to him, something which is habitual is not necessarily iterative. So there is a difference there. See, when I say, for instance, Simon used to believe in ghosts, of course, it's a habitual situation since its characteristic, it's ordinary to an extended period of time. So during that period, for instance, during his childhood, he used to believe in ghosts. So that is habitual, but not iterative. Since this is a situation which is stative and not dynamic, we can't imagine that it would repeat like the iterative situations. Of course, sometimes we can have these features positive in the same sentences, both features. So we can say, when I was a child or during my childhood, I used to escape from the ghosts. Of course, in this case, we have habituality and also an iterative situation, but not necessarily something that is habitual has to be iterative. And that one example which merges habituality with stative situations show us that clearly. I don't know if that was clear. Okay, thank you.
It's okay. It's okay. And Achilles, if no question has arrived, I would like you, Adriana and Matheus, a question by myself.
Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Back to the contest of alleged violation of the functional sequence as proposed by Cinque 1999, namely cases involving modification, checking theory, raising of an adverb to the left periphery, etc. I would like to know, how can you make it sure that in the experiments conducted, volunteers were not dealing with Cinque's orders, but with these cases of alleged violation? Did you provide them with a registration or any type of acoustic input?
So thank you, Professor Sandra, for the question. And actually, we really understand that it's possible. So perhaps some of our participants may have applied a different prosody when, for example, reading or even answering our forms. So it's possible to say that due to the fact that we haven't had applied acoustic input, we were not controlling, for instance, non-marked or flat prosody, it's possible as well that some of the informants may have gone over to that kind of Sierra. So that's something that I intend to remedy and to compare in my PhD dissertation, because I truly believe that when we provide acoustic input with flat intonation, we avoid this kind of possibility to explain our results. So it's something that I'm really in depth to, that I intend to remedy. And thank you for the observation as well. And also, as we were just saying, that it's possible that the informants, not just by means of reading out loud the text or the sentence, but by making a silent reading, had applied some intrinsic prosody. Because when we are reading, we had a voice in our head which is reading certain words. So therefore, it's possible that some of the stimuli that we had presented may have had influenced the way that the participants might have had read in its internal reading, that silent reading. So intrinsic prosody is a thing, and we are extremely interested in controlling this in a next investigation. But that's something that we hadn't done. We hadn't provided acoustic input.
Thank you very much, Sandra. Yeah, that's really a concern. I'm sure that during his PhD, Matheus is going to have success studying that with controlling acoustic input, controlling that to avoid that alleged violation.
Trust me, I'll master Pratt one day. It's difficult, but I'll do it. I mastered art, so.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know it's not easy, but I really think it is interesting, really interesting for your PhD research. I know it is necessary. Thank you, Matheus.
Thank you, Sandra.
And it seems a student from the NEG group sent us the following question. Could you please explain again why this scope principle by Ernest 1991 you mentioned cannot be maintained in light of the experiment results achieved?
Okay, thank you for the question. Wow, I feel really important to say so, but that's something that it's too strong, I guess. It's not a fact of cannot be maintained, but it goes to the different opposite lines. So when we have earnest scope principle, regardless of the order that we are to find in a certain sentence, the scope relation would be the same. So according to this idea, order and scope would be negotiated in direct merge, in the first merge position. So therefore, the notion of regressive scope would not even make sense in the scope principle approach as proposed by Ernest 1991. That's not something that I say that it's wrong or right. That's not what I really mean. I just say that I, myself, and Professor Adriana, we understand that some of the terminology and some of the results may go to a different line of earnest understanding, but not necessarily that our analysis or his analysis are better or worse. Just that it does not make sense to speak of, to even acknowledge the notion of regressive scope in an earnest approach, if I'm really that used to the way that Ernest had described his principle.
Yeah, and we did find differences related to the progressive scope and still almost. So with these adverbs especially, we did have this influence. So maybe we could really have, we had to flexibilize a little bit this principle, this scope principle, because that was our intention with this research, to see if different orders could trigger different readings. And with some adverbs, we did find so. So maybe not invalidate, but to say that we could read this principle with some concerning some adverbs and not all of them.
And it's important to say that we are not really here in an effort to falsify a scope principle which has been such widely adopted in the literature of cartography or even the generative theory as a whole. We're just presenting new data that if we have a way to explain this relevance between the still almost and almost still and regressive and progressive scope, we would be happy to hear it from someone which adopts explicitly this principle. So in a Popperian way, our results do not directly falsify this notion, just present a way to a new data to explain it in terms of this principle.
Okay, thank you. And is there anyone here in the Zoom who would like to ask a question?
Me.
Kids,
Me.
please
Me.
open your camera and turn on your microphone.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. Thank you for your support, Professor Adriana and Matheus, and for the presentation of such a very nice paper. Well, I should say that I had the pleasure of reading Matheus' MA thesis as I was in his MA thesis committee, and I can now see that you, Matheus, working with Professor Adriana, did many progress in such a very short time from March till now. So congratulations. My question is, as for the WebCop results, how can you be sure that you are dealing with the checking of, for instance, information features in CP, remnant movement, etc.? I am asking this because the information available at WebCop is linear order. So how can you be methodologically sure that linear order is the result in those cases of, for instance, those processes like remnant movements or even checking of a feature in the left periphery? So this is my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Akles, for your question. Wow, being sure is what I really intend to be in my life. I'm not really sure if I had eaten properly this morning, so I cannot really be sure about what is being actually stated as a result in the WebCorp analysis. That's just an interpretation that we had. I mean, it's obvious that in a way that when we are dealing with corpus, we do not have indirect evidence of what is not possible in a certain language. But in these cases, we had direct evidence of orders that are possible in the WebCorp analysis. And it's not just one or two, but there are many. And our interpretations were that in a way, perhaps these non-sequent linear orders by means either of intrinsic prosody being applied and therefore triggering movement to the left periphery by the one who had written these orders, or even if we acknowledge the formedness of this sentence and trying to explain it by means remnant movement, it's also possible to say so, but it's not something that I'm really, really sure, because of course, when we are dealing with corpus analysis, we are not dealing with experiments as a whole. We are just analyzing data in general. So of course, that's a way to explain our results, but perhaps there could be other hypotheses that are even more fine-tuned to our results and our theoretical framework. But no, I'm not really that sure. Okay, that's just a way to interpret.
No, I would like to add that it's important to mention, I'm not sure if it was clear during the presentation, that this corp is a written web corp. Some corpora are with the written material and the audio material, but we had only access to the written material. It was not something that was produced and transcribed. It was really written. It was a written material. So if we could check some corpus with both kind of data, audio material and written material, it would be easier to check that. We were just giving an interpretation, because we know that there is the possibility of an internal prosody that although that was linearized that way, the internal prosody could show that there was a movement to the left periphery. But it was just a hypothesis and a kind of interpretation, and we cannot be sure with the order that was really linearized.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Akili, for your question.
Thank you for your answer. Well, I have another question, if I may. I promise it is going to be my last question. Now, if I got you right, paper by the two of you, together with Juliana Nespoli, whom I have gotten the pleasure of joining her PhD committee years ago, you told that when we have still almost and almost still, this is the only case, if I got you right, Matheus, this is the only case of real deviation of Cinque's order in your research. Is this right? I didn't get how can you explain how you explained actually this non-Cinquean order in this case. Did you say that in that case, I mean, when we have the deviation order, we have adverbs which are, for instance, underspecified in the lexicon and then compatible with more positions within the sentence. So we are not playing exactly with the same projections in one case and the same projections in the other case?
Yeah, that's the question I aim to ask you, Professor. It's about the test that we have mentioned, the recent investigation. So,
together with Juliana
the recent
Nespoli,
investigation, if I have some minutes to state, was applied to 15 formats of British English, and we have presented Cinquean linear order and non-Cinquean linear order without any kind of context. And the task was to provide judgments of happiness, so judgments of well-formedness in a Likert scale from 1 to 5. We had piled up all the results, and then we had provided our statistic analysis, and the only context in which our informants did not like the well-formedness of non-Cinquean linear order is the one with almost still. They liked still almost a lot, and they did not like almost still. But there were no kinds of contexts with no context. When we apply context, which is the result of my dissertation, the only context, according to our tests presented here, in which linear order is intertwined to progressive and regressive scope, is the still almost and almost still. So the results can be interpreted as dialogical in a sense that without any sort of context, speakers tend not really to like that order. But when we provide a regressive scope context according to our result with almost still, students, informants, for instance, would be okay with the order because we are dealing with regressive scope. So that's what I really meant. I don't mean to say that's a deviation per se of a universal order of merge. I just intend to say that speakers of English, 50 speakers of English, in a statistically significant way, did not like almost still when we apply no context. But when we did apply, they liked it that much with regressive scope. So there is something that is really, really interesting. That's what I meant to say. But the second part of your question, let me just read it. We have adverbs which are unspecified in the lexicon and thus comfortable with more positions within the structure. Well, that's in fact was one of our hypotheses about not really duplication per se. I was not really that happy with that name, but the fact that some adverbs may be comfortable to different positions as well. So perhaps that's a way to explain this. But when we were stating the results of these recent investigation, we were just saying that without context, participants did not like almost still, but with context, regressive scope context, they liked it that much. So the results are dialogical. I don't know if I made myself clear in terms of answering your question, your brilliant question.
It's all clear. Thank you so much, Matheus. Thank you.
Thank you, Achilles. Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you, Achilles, for your questions. And, oh, Professor Jean, a colleague of yours, Adriana, sent a hello and his congratulations in YouTube's chat.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the audience.
Yeah. All right. It's almost lunch time, so maybe it's better. Let's end it here. Thank you so much, Professor Adriana and Matheus, for being here with us today. And thank you all who attended the conference. It was a great pleasure for us. And Professor Achilles, would you like to say anything?
Yes, thank you, Professor Sandra, for your partnership, first of all, and also our students who have helped us here broadcasting this Zoom na Cartografia. Thank you, Matheus, and thank you, Adriana, for your participation in the presentation of such an interesting paper, which shows our international audience the cartography made in Brazil. In the way you did, also turn to some experiments, you convincingly show that the research on synthetic cartography made here in our country is on the right track in spite of our government, unfortunately, I should say so. It's our pleasure to also announce our next speaker, Professor Xavier Bilalba Nicolá from Spain, who is going to give a talk entitled The Left Periphery of Non-Finite Relatives and Interrogatives in Romance. It is going to take place on September 29. So see you in the next Zoom na Cartografia, and long life to synthetic cartography. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the honorable invitation. Bye-bye.